Welcome once again, friends, to what I have chosen to call a history of rock and roll in film and rock and roll. You may call it what you like. Now, today is Elvis. And it's a special one. It requires a bit of setup. A bit of preamble, if you will. But this will just be a part one of at least 2 or maybe 3. We'll find out as we go. Together. Now, if you've heard previous episodes in the past, you're probably ready for what's coming now, which is time for me to introduce my bias. It says, to be completely open and upfront, I was a child of the 80s. I think I was pretty much spared from a lot of over-glorification of Elvis. I mean, we didn't listen to him in my household, my home. Actually, yeah, and where I grew up, my household makes it sound like I owned it. So I didn't have a lot of preconceived notions about Elvis that didn't just come from pop culture. There were probably more instances of me listening to Living Colour and Public Enemy than Elvis in my entire life. And I bring up those 2 examples because in the early 1990s, we had songs like Elvis is Dead from Living Colour and Fight the Power from Public Enemy that both spoke somewhat disparagingly of the king. And if you don't like salty language, maybe skip ahead. I'm going to use the F word a little bit because I'm quoting some people. But then again, if you don't like those words, then you're not going to be able to listen to some of the direct quotes from Elvis and the Memphis Mafia and other people that I'll be quoting later on in the episode. But that is not to say this episode is going to be a grand debunking of any big legends, and I'm not going to be a deconstruction. I'm not out for blood here. I don't have an interest in besmirching the man's character. I, if anything, have more sympathy for him after having read what I've read and watched what I've watched and listened to in terms of accounts of other people in his life. Now back to Living Colour and Public Enemy. I've found that accounts of Elvis's supposed racism or racial bias have been dismissible without evidence to back them up, no matter how hip it gets to keep bringing up those rumors and those apocryphal quotes. Jim Jarmusch in Coffee and Cigarettes, that scene with Steve Buscemi playing the clueless yokel waiter who looks foolish for having a positive opinion of Elvis when they go ahead and quote, all black people can do for me is shine my shoes. Vernon Reid, the lead guitarist and key songwriter for Living Colour, himself on Twitter said, this apocryphal quote, that this old American saw was almost certainly manufactured by Colonel, he put that in quotes, and we'll get to that in a bit, Tom Parker, a Dutch national whose racism was legendary. And then he writes, in quotes, with Elvis, there was not a single drop of racism in that man. And when I say that, believe me, I should know. B.B. King. Vernon Reid then publishes a photo of a very young B.B. King with a young Elvis Presley standing next to each other. And he says, there is a photograph at Sun Studios. Oh, I take it back. He didn't publish the photo. One of his followers published the photo below this comment by Vernon Reid of Living Colour. There is a photograph at Sun Studios, never widely circulated, of B.B. King with Elvis as a young man, unforced, unposed. It is clear they were good friends. Parker worked assiduously to distance, all caps, Elvis from black people, whom he was comfortable with, to reassure white Southern fans. And then there was people trying to argue with him, and he's like, hey, you going to argue with B.B. King? Fucking knock it off. What is in, all those years after Elvis died, why would it be in his best interest to prop the man up? He didn't need that. And another fan of Vernon's followed up with this quote from a Guardian interview with what has to be Chuck D, because he's referencing the song lyrics for Fight the Power. The question is, have you changed your views on Elvis? And the answer is, I never personally had something against Elvis, but the American way of putting him up as the king and the great icon is disturbing. You can't ignore black history. Now they've trained people to ignore all other history. They come over with this homogenized crap. So Elvis was just the fall guy in my lyrics for all of that. It was nothing personal, believe me. The interview says, okay, but you're right about John Wayne. Because I was right about John Wayne. Fuck him. I think if anything, for a lot of folks my age, the sort of rehabilitation of Elvis's, coolness might have started when True Romance came out, the Tony Scott directed film written by Quentin Tarantino, one of his first scripts that he sold. And it opens up with Christian Slater talking about how cool Elvis was at a certain period in his career. I think it's worth checking out if you're an Elvis fan and you've never seen the film. You can probably just find it on YouTube, opening speech, True Romance, Elvis Presley, whatever. Still, I did perceive a bit of a stink about the Elvis legacy for people my age that comes from more than one element. There was a tabloid obsession with Elvis sightings all through the 80s when I was a kid. They'd be staring you in the face while you're standing in line at the grocery checkout counter. There was then followed by this sarcastic backlash against all things mainstream, white, and venerated. As the 1990s dawned, Elvis seemed like he was overhyped and overshadowing many artists of the time that deserved more attention. Yes, but without Elvis, it stands to reason, in my opinion, they wouldn't have gotten that attention during or after the fact anyways. I don't think we can look at all the other artists that did the same songs as him that weren't as popular. And I'm talking about his contemporaries at Sun Records that were white, and I'm talking about the pioneers who first recorded the songs that he eventually made famous and presumably made those songwriters rich. If the books got done according to, the legal precedent of publishing payments for ASCAP or BMI. And looking back on the craziness of the merchandising and such, the crassness, the cheapness of the Elvis merchandising endeavors that put his face on dolls and masks and stand-up, cardboard posters and all kinds of whatever, lunch pails or bric-a-brac that is more suited to Mickey Mouse than a real living person. It can make you want to retch, especially if you're an out-of-touch parent at the time in the 50s or a cynical teenager like me in the 90s. Of course, similar things were done with the Beatles or to the Beatles similarly by their management, who was collecting money through that merchandising that the artist had no right to. They found out after the fact. They had a harder time getting to that money. It wasn't linked to their music or their publishing rights or performances, right? So deals are made to license their likenesses and then exploit them. And, it doesn't really go to the musicians because it's not music. And that was one of the key parts of their managers, their American managers' dealings was, setting up all those little products and selling them to American fans and then collecting all the money and giving none of it to the Beatles. Now, the Beatles managed to change music and popular culture with so much intellectual overcorrection that we don't really think of them, in the same mind that has the awareness that, yes, there were plastic dolls and lunch pails and costumes and wigs of the Beatles. We think of them in various stages. We think of them musically. Then we think of the certain haircuts and costumes of their own or styles of dress from different eras when they were sort of unified in their images from time to time, whether it was, Sgt. Pepper's outfits or the leather outfits or the mop top and suit era, whatever. And then some of us might remember that they were a cartoon, and some of us might remember various things they said in interviews or in public press conferences that sticks with us. But overall, we remember the Beatles as musicians. And after them came Kiss. They were made for this kind of merchandising and they took it to new heights, but they owned it in a different way than the two examples that came before them that they learned from. I mean that figuratively and literally. They owned it in terms of, the idea of it was theirs and they said, we're not ashamed of this. And people called them sellouts for even selling T-shirts and posters at their concerts, even though other bands, I think Zeppelin had done posters. Maybe they didn't do T-shirts. Maybe that wasn't the cool thing to do at the time. But, while they were touring, I'm saying not later. And they owned it in that spiritual sense and that cerebral sense, but they also literally owned the rights to their own likenesses and the money that came in from every single product they put out. But in the case of Elvis, it is just one person who became much bigger and simultaneously emptier in that process, in my opinion. Not like celebrity stars before him, like Jerry Lee Lewis or Bob Hope or Gene Autry, that were merchandised and promoted like crazy and made into national figures of worship and idolatry for how well they entertained America. And, their likenesses were on a lot of silly pieces of merchandise. But contrary to that model, Elvis was being taken advantage of and being hated for it by the public at the same time, meaning the part of the public that wasn't his young fans. And we'll see later in this episode when we read some reviews and some interviews with some snide, snarky, that's the newer word for it, but, condescending interviewers. Elvis is the first in a long line of rock stars that are that have to be better than their interviewers, that have to be smarter and have to sort of have some moral high ground and display it. He had to do that the way that, later on, Johnny Rotten from the Sex Pistols would have to do it. Marilyn Manson, whether you hate him, I understand, for things he supposedly has done to other people in his personal life. He still was, for a short time, the smartest guy on TV when it came to interviewing rock stars. He was talked down to openly, like Elvis, like Johnny Rotten, like Jim Morrison, like Lou Reed, and generally came out looking smarter and more tolerant, even at the even at the most volatile reactions. Okay, maybe not Johnny Rotten all the time, but he didn't have to put up with any of that shit if he didn't want to. Now, I want to say that I do really love Elvis music. I'm fascinated by his story, but I'm fascinated by the story of rock and roll. I don't think anyone could have come along and did what he did. I don't think it just could have happened to, some easily manipulated young person that the Colonel got a hold of or, and exploited. I think he had the goods in a lot of ways, and he was a very soulful performer and singer. And I think the best things that are written about him and spoken about him are true. Doesn't mean we're not going to have a lot of bad behavior to talk about anyways. And it doesn't mean that I'm not going to enjoy telling those stories about bad behavior, because that's what I do like about this whole endeavor with the history of rock and roll and film and rock and roll. Besides the inspiring elements, I enjoy wild stories of people in extreme situations behaving destructively, because it's well after the fact and I wasn't there to have to deal with it and put up with them and clean up after them. I think that's pretty fair compared to what people tried to do to his reputation in the 80s. And the 80s were a time of tell-all books. It was also a time of demystifying some legends for fun and profit. And also a time when someone like, let's say, Priscilla Presley was probably faced with, somebody telling her, hey, you're not getting anything from Elvis or his estate. How about you tell your story with all the juicy details in there, and you finally get paid, by an adoring public for what you've suffered through. Can't blame her for that. And so I am going to read from bits and pieces of her story, as well as a few members of the Memphis Mafia that were the first ones to put out a tell-all book, and it came out only months or so before Elvis passed away. But for a large portion of this I'm going to be relying on Peter Guralnick, who is the definitive biographer of Elvis and has been in various forms over a span of decades. If you're a big Elvis fan and you haven't read his 2 books, just trust me, that's all you really need. He took every single source that was available and compiled a whole story of the man's life, basically. Now, I became more of a fan of Elvis's music when I started listening to more music from the 50s via a Rhino Records compilation called Loud, Fast, and Out of Control, The Wild Sounds of 50s Rock. If you can find it, get it. Find various playlists of it online. You could go to archive.org and find the digital uploads of the CDs put there by some nice people, because maybe you don't have the ability to pay hundreds of dollars for the CD set that came out in the early 2000s, late 90s or whatever it was. I was able to buy it when it was new, but, CDs get lost over the years. So I was happy to go to, once again, www.archive.org and do a search for those discs and find them in a few nice, easy-to-download bundles of MP3s. And I really did appreciate Elvis's uniqueness compared to his peers collected on that set of discs for the time. There's a big difference between the Carl Perkins version of Blue Suede Shoes and the Elvis Presley version of Blue Suede Shoes. Carl's version is not in a hurry. It's very sort of teasing at the beginning. He's, because it's a 1 for the money, ba-dum-bum, and he waits for a beat, and it's 2 for the show, dun-dun-dun. 3 to get ready. Now go, cat, go into, and it kicks in. It starts swinging, right? But he kind of wants you to know he's not going to let the song start until he wants it to start. He's very cool about it. And Elvis is not. He's very intense, and he's very, go, bam, 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 let's launch into this thing. The immediacy that he has, I think, was a sharp contrast to the more cool-headed country music, rockabilly guys that maybe had a little bit more age and experience on him and a little more songwriting experience, I guess. Again, sorry. I mean, he wasn't much for writing songs, but he was an encyclopedia of songs himself. I've come across comments like that more than once. Like, he just knew everything. He was just this human jukebox, possessed great capacity for, all different eras of like standards and gospel and, country music and, hillbilly music. I don't think a person that loves music like that has hate in their heart for Black America. Not saying it's impossible. It's very possible after the fact, generations later, yes. But I don't think it doesn't seem to have been in his character to just be someone like essentially raping and pillaging this songbook of the Black South and giving no one credit for it and trying to take all the glory for himself. I think that's what made the public angry at him, was that the glory was just being thrown at him, and he was so young, and I'm sure to a lot of people's minds he hadn't earned that, but that's not how it works. Like, the word deserve has nothing to do with it, or the earning part of it, or the how many years are you supposed to pay your dues. Sorry, if you've got it and people want it, you're going to take off. But I'm young enough and old enough simultaneously to be able to appreciate all those good things about him and his music and his performances, and still laugh my ever-loving balls off when I see Jack White's ridiculous portrayal of Elvis in a cameo in the movie Walk Hard, the Dewey Cox story. I can do that and still give Elvis his due for how many chances he took and how well he sang and how captivating his body language was on stage and in surviving documentation of his more casual moments that you see, hanging around with friends and family. It's not so with JFK, though, is it? One has to muse. I mean, not for all of us, knowing what we know. If you're in the Camelot cult, nothing's going to change that for you, and more power to you. If you don't want to believe all the stuff that came out about the Kennedys after the fact, I get it. But you're probably of a certain age that's not listening to this anyways. You're like a great-great-grandparent that's been living in Boston their entire life. Now, of course, every episode has a movie subject, and this subject is another creator who I've enjoyed the works of quite a bit more than Elvis when it comes to frequency. I've watched a lot of John Carpenter movies multiple times. I don't make excuses for the guy when he sucks, but it's hard for me to dwell on the things in his career I don't like because, quite frankly, I came of age during a time when he was beginning one of the lowest points in his creative movie output, which is to say, seeing in quick succession as soon as they came out in the theaters, 1996 or 97's Escape from L.A., then 1999's Vampires, and then 2000 whatever it was is Ghosts of Mars. No John Carpenter fan truly loves those above the movies that came before them, I don't think. And with decent reason. But what launched me into John Carpenter fandom, like so many other people, of course, who loves horror movies and loves the autumn months, it was the movie Halloween. I saw that I saw that also in the mid 1990s before Escape from LA came out. I was interested in Escape from LA because I knew Rob Zombie was hanging around on the set with John Carpenter in a photograph that I had seen, and White Zombie had a song on the soundtrack, and they were my favorite band. So I was in. Well, everyone else hated it. I thought it was a lot of fun. I didn't realize how different it was from the first film, Escape from New York. That's a conversation for another day, because I don't want to bore you Elvis fans with my musings on John Carpenter's whole history, just the part where he gets hooked up with Dick Clark. And Dick Clark wants very much for a talented yet budget-conscious filmmaker to help him rehabilitate the reputation of Elvis Presley in the era, in the year and a half immediately after the King's death, and sordid details of that death being very much in the public consciousness and probably staining the legacy. And I don't know if that means Dick was doing it for his own noble reasons or if he had some stake in Elvis records selling again. I don't know that he was financially entangled with any of those accounts, but maybe he's seeing it being a mutually beneficial thing for the preservation of the soul of rock and roll in his eyes. Who knows? And it turns out that Dick Clark got wind of the fact that John Carpenter had done his own soundtrack work for the Halloween film that was a huge success for something so low budget and independent. And he had also a great work ethic because around the same time he was putting out a made-for-TV movie called Someone's Watching Me, another faceless killer stalking a woman kind of a story. And he's kind of known for being pretty sentimental about things, but when it comes down to the information I can find out about the reasons for doing Elvis, he just says, I'm bringing a lot of my own feelings to it and how I feel about him. It's a personal film because I've always loved Elvis and I've always been a fan. I care about his character and I care about his story. Even 35 years later, when asked about it, he just said, when asked why he did it, he said, I loved Elvis Presley. And I think that comes across very nicely in the way all of his characters are treated in the film. It doesn't shy away from showing a few uncomfortable moments. And but those are there to sort of let you know, if you already know more than the average person, what that's an indicator of. This is my feeling and my opinion. Sort of like, the mama's boy stuff and the violent mood swings towards the end of his life. Those are depicted, but the depth of what they really signify is only hinted at, not explored. One of the nicest things about this is the obvious chemistry that John Carpenter must have established early on with Kurt Russell, because the camera loves him. He's obviously taking direction very well. I mean, he's no slouch. He's been in a ton of Disney movies at this point as a kid. He was actually in a film with Elvis Presley when Elvis was 27 in 1963. It happened at the World's Fair here in Seattle, Washington. Thank you very much. And he plays a little boy who kicks Elvis in the shin in one scene, uncredited, I believe. But 15 years after that, he's playing Elvis himself in his first adult professional acting role. Oh, and another thing that is displayed, but more than hinted at, but not belabored, is the psychological effect on young and growing and maturing Elvis Presley of the fact that he had a twin brother who died in the womb. The brother had a name, Jesse, and his mother at one point in the film, played amazingly by Shelley Winters. Holy smokes, she's a powerhouse in this. She suggests to him that, this wild energy that's leaping out of him that gets him in trouble, but also makes him such a captivating performer, must stem from the fact that he's got the extra sort of energy and strength of his brother, that he's the one that lived. Therefore, he's got more than one whole human being's essence in him, essentially. I'm going to read some direct quotes from birthmoviesdeath.com, a 2015 article about this movie titled Emergency Myth-Making, John Carpenter's Elvis. This is a good resource to check out if you need more of an overview on this, I guess, than listening to my multi-hour podcast about it. But I think this chunk of the article that I've been kind of using as a base for the lead up to this movie conversation, this little chunk here is better just to read word for word than to have me summarize it. Elvis's rise is portrayed as being tumultuous and bumpy, but the filmmakers are printing the legend, and any and all of Elvis's struggles have an undercurrent of nobility to them, painted in broad strokes. The death of Elvis's mother does not cause him to turn to pills and food and to sleepwalk through 31 movies. Her death breaks his heart and sends him on a spiritual journey. His courtship of 14-year-old Priscilla, played by Susan Hubley, is not weird and questionable, but has a charming Southern gentleman quality to it. When he smashes up a room and terrifies his pregnant wife, it's not because of substances or an unchecked ego surrounded by yes men. It's because they're messing with my songs and putting Elvis's background singers too low in the mix. The Jordanaires, his favorite group of background singers that he had seen perform, before he had the opportunity to hire them and just put them on his records, which he loved. Sorry, that was an aside from me, not in the article. The only real finger pointing, this is the point here, is aimed at fame and at a world too eager to take everything that matters from Elvis's personal life. There's drama, but it never digs too deep. The wounds are still too fresh, and Elvis, the movie, is handling its subject with extra care. That's probably the best summary I could give anyone that just found out that this movie existed. If you want to know what the movie's all about, what the movie's attitude is and how it approaches the subject matter, I think that was perfection. So hats off to you, Phil Noble Jr., a lifelong movie lover and Emmy award-winning writer-producer based in Philadelphia, currently the editor-in-chief and creative director of the recently relaunched Fangoria magazine. Reading the byline at the bottom. Executive producer of the acclaimed Shudder documentary Horror Noir, which definitely gets lots and lots of, I believe, deserved praise. Shout out, Phil. I should start following you on Twitter. And hey, if you want to follow this show on Twitter, it's at RockFilmRock on Twitter. I'm going to read a bit about Scotty Moore, guitarist for Elvis Presley. Back in 54, when he had done a little bit of work recording at Sun Records with Sam Phillips on a track by the Starlight Wranglers, a couple of short solo bits, I guess, he got to play on there. he and Sam got to be good friends. And he said, I would go down almost every day in the afternoon when I get off work and sit next door in the cafe with Sam and drink coffee and talk about what's being played on the radio and different styles of music. I think we were both searching. I think we both felt there needed to be something different, but nobody knew that. The whole music business was sort of in a low ebb back then, pop everything. It just seemed to be down. There wasn't very much excitement going on. So one day we were talking and his secretary brought up Elvis's name. He had been in there to make a record for his mother. And I worried Sam to death for a couple of weeks to get a hold of him. And he finally got her to give me his number, and I called him. He came over to my house, and we just sat, and he played. It seemed like he knew every song in the world. I think that's another nice thing that the John Carpenter film portrays pretty well. Various points in the movie, you see Elvis displaying his sort of, internal songbook, all the things he's absorbed and easily been able to replicate in his own style. It's like a human jukebox of various genres and generations. And he said, Bill lived a few doors down from me, Bill Black. And he came over and listened for a while. And after he left, I called Sam and said, the boy has a decent voice, knows all the songs, has good timing. And he said it sounded like we should give him a shot. He said, I'll call him and get him to come to the studio tomorrow night. He said, just you and Bill come in. We don't need the whole band. I just want a little bit of background noise to see how it sounds on tape. Smart, good experiment. See how the tape responds to the way these three get together, right? In the room at Sun Records with the mics that you got, and then decide, okay, I'm not going to waste, because you don't want to waste someone else's time, because you got to pay musicians, supposedly. I mean, not now, but then you did. But even if you weren't paying them, they'd be doing you a favor by sitting in with some unknown, fella. To do what? Sing? Play horn parts or string parts or extra, I don't know, or drums? Now, who knows? They don't know what to do with them yet. So, smart move. Sam's got time. Scotty's got time. Bill's got time. Let's bring him in. And Scotty says, we did. And we went in and, ran through, I don't know how many songs, different styles, tempos, ballads. And during a break, he started cutting up and singing, That's All Right. And I fell in with him, playing along with it. Sam heard it through the door because the studio door was open. And he came in and said, what are you all doing? We said, just goofing around. And he said, well, goof around some more. Let me see what it sounds like. We were just like jamming, not trying to do anything, just jamming, cutting up. And the rest, as they say, is history. Blue Moon of Kentucky came about the same way. After we did That's All Right, Sam said, okay, we have to have a B-side. And again, we went in and everybody was scratching their brains trying to think of songs to try. And this time, Bill, again, during the break, started Blue Moon of Kentucky. It was originally a waltz, but he started singing it up-tempo in a high falsetto voice, just mimicking Bill Monroe. Elvis knew the song, so he started, and we all just fell in again. Everything we did on Sun was done the same way. We had absolutely no material going in. We just go in and start kicking things around. Sam would mention some of the R&B stuff he had done, and we'd try some of that, That's All Right was just something Elvis had heard on the radio and knew, but every session we did on Sun was done the same way, just through trial and error until something would just finally click. You didn't know what you'd come out with. And there were a few times when you didn't get anything, and you just come back the next day or two. Radio play for That's All Right was phenomenal. And Sam couldn't get records pressed fast enough. When he first started pressing them, he had 5,000 backordered just from local orders. I think in the back of our minds, Bill and I thought it was just a one-record thing, a fluke, because it was so different from everything else that was out there. But you still had to go for what you had. I guess after the first record made so much noise, different artists started going in and getting auditions with Sam, guys who tried to sound like Elvis. Like I said, we thought the business in general needed something different, but nobody knew what. And it was a fluke. Like the first record, we'd Figured we'd go in and Sam will say, okay, I'll take a chance on Elvis and we'll get a full band in and start cutting something. But it just didn't work that way. And it may not have worked if he had done that. Who knows? From the radio reaction, we figured we don't need anything else. Let's talk about the movie a little bit. More of my notes from when I first watched it, might have been about a year ago. I really did think at that time that I was going to start this podcast series with, early rock and roll and kind of go in order and then move into the 60s and 70s and 80s and 90s. That definitely didn't happen, obviously, if you look at my track listing. But I guess that would make this even further back than a year ago. Anyhow, I mean, I have the original notes I wrote while I was watching this, and it's so funny to think that I clearly thought that I was going to follow this early episode up with my Little Richard episode, which I still have not completed because watching that made-for-TV movie is very difficult. If anyone talks any trash about this Elvis made-for-TV movie by the great John Carpenter, they can just go ahead and watch the Little Richard made-for-TV movie made 20 years later, supposedly, one would think with more money and production value. No, it's not nearly, as a film, not nearly as good. It's very corny and cheap and television-y, which doesn't mean it's bad or not worth watching. Now, the first note I wrote down while watching it just happened at the very first shot in the film. God damn, does John Carpenter know how to pick a song and shoot a car on the highway. Funny that this is the day I happen to be recording myself saying this finally, as I was wearing a Christine t-shirt earlier today to work and to the gym. Carpenter does know how to shoot a car. And I think it was Mystery Train that was playing. The Elvis voice that you hear singing in the film is not Elvis Presley. It is a talented singer, impersonator fellow who does a commentary track on the film, along with the woman who says she's Elvis's cousin or one of his cousins, and they're both very nice and soft-spoken and reverent and pleasant. I haven't sat through the whole thing with them because they're sort of reacting to the movie, many years after it was put out and just sort of reminiscing here and there, like, oh yeah, he was, they said, because it then cuts to some scenes of Elvis in a hotel room and some concerned people around him. And they give you the impression he's very paranoid about being attacked or assassination attempts. And it's true that at that time he was suspicious that Lee Harvey Oswald might be coming for him. He was very quick to temper, says the gentleman on the commentary. My notes in here about Kurt Russell. He first appeared on celluloid, and it happened at the World's Fair when he kicked Elvis in the shin. Then he became famous as a child and as a child and teen actor for Disney. The Computer Wore Tennis Shoes, I think, was one of his more famous ones. As a young teen, he had also married the woman in this film who played Priscilla. He'd make some of his best appearances on film with John Carpenter after this. I can't think of anyone else from this time who could do the job and look like Elvis. I don't think impersonating the king was the industry it would become later. Funny enough, he looks more like the king when he gets his long hair cut off for military service. CBS, I then wrote, put Gone with the Wind on against ABC's Elvis when it premiered. And I think NBC was showing One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. Those three, at the time, those networks were not giving an inch. They were going to try to crush this. They knew folks wanted to watch an Elvis biopic, but they probably figured, well, it's not a big mainstream movie. It's not in theaters. We can show a classier film. People will watch that instead, but it didn't work. They watched John Carpenter's Elvis, and it's like more than 3 hours, I believe. So I don't know if it was all in one night or if it was spread out over 2 nights like a miniseries. I know that in the UK, it premiered in theaters in a different cut. There was like an edit of some scenes out. The next section of my notes And I've decided I'm not going to go do any sleuthing as to why. It says drugs, amphetamines, biphetamines, black widows. And then I'd copied and pasted. Biphetamine is a prescription medication that is often sold under the brand name of Adderall. In addition to using it for ADHD and ADD, it is also used to help with weight loss and as an appetite suppressant. Biphetamine is made from amphetamines and dextroamphetamine, and it is extremely potent. Now, next part I had was about Elvis shooting out television sets. This really did happen. The story is true. However, because I think they show him do it in the movie early on. It wasn't a violent act in any real way, according to the Elvis Presley official fan site in Australia that has a lot of great records of everything that happened in his life. But it was more an ongoing joke he had with the guys. I think the movie portrays this as a real serious act of violence and anger because he was pissed off at something, someone he wanted to kill on the screen. But other accounts I've read just say that it was just sort of a fun in-joke that he could just blow away TVs and then have the guys pick it up and throw it in the graveyard and bring him a new one. And the graveyard being his backyard at Graceland. TV graveyard, not, take it to an actual graveyard with people in it. And there was some to-do and some fuss about the fact that he had shot out a couple of TVs that people noticed while Robert Goulet was on the screen. He had heard about Elvis shooting out TVs whenever he saw him singing on a television program. He himself insists that Elvis bore him no ill will and was actually a friend of his. He claimed that Elvis shot the TV when other singers like Mel Torme and Frank Sinatra came on. He didn't think that, there was a specific hatred toward him in particular. So in a interview with the Commercial Appeal in Memphis, I guess that's a local paper of some renown, they say, now I have to ask you what my colleagues say is going to be the hardest question. Goulet immediately replies with, I'm not Jewish, I'm not gay. No, those are easy. Goulet laughs. Memphis is an Elvis town, and you factor into a local legend. Goulet said, when he shot the television set, he also shot 50 other people. They told me he had about 100 sets in the basement, and he'd shoot the damn thing out. He was on pills, and he didn't know quite what he was doing, and he'd bang, and they'd look at each other and say, get another set. They mention me all the time. I don't know why. I'm assuming there were Elvis biographers and various people made note of seeing him shoot Goulet in the face while he was on TV. But he says, I remember once we sat together backstage for 2 hours, and he was a charming, delightful man. And at one point, remember, if you ever run out of things to say that are nice about somebody after the first two adjectives, just repeat the second one again, I guess. At one point I said, that's a beautiful ring you have there. He said, you like it? I said, it's beautiful. He took it off his hand and put it on mine. He gave me his ring. And years later, all the jewelry I had in my house, I trust everybody. I was brought up to believe that you cannot steal, cheat, or lie. And I've been stolen from, cheated, or lied to all my life. And so jewelry, who needs it? But this one was something special to me, and it's gone. They asked, somebody took it? Goulet said, I hired a guy to take care of my house while I was gone. I'm so naive, it's ridiculous, because, when we hire people today, we do a background check. I didn't do that. I was in Dallas doing something, and I got a call from LAPD. We have a Stutz Blackhawk silver with gold trim and an RGG license plate. I said, you have it? How do you have it? Well, we saw this guy going through Watts driving this car with the window open, throwing out $100 bills. He had taken all my jewelry and everything else I had of import and taken my car and driven it down to L.A. But all my good stuff is just gone, finished. It's all part of dying. And then they ask him again about the, Elvis. We write so much about Elvis here. What was your reaction when you heard he shot the TV? Goulet said, the point is, I knew he was not himself. So therefore, it wasn't anything to do with me. He shot out Mel Torme. He shot out Frank. But I get all the credit. All right, let's talk about the scene where Elvis and the boys go to the Grand Ole Opry to play Blue Moon of Kentucky for Mr. Denny to try to see if they can get on the Grand Ole Opry because, Sam's arranged for them to have some sort of middle of the afternoon or evening audition or something when there's nothing else going on and the whole place is empty. This didn't happen in the way it's portrayed. I'm willing to believe that someone at some point told Elvis to stick to driving trucks instead of playing songs. And there was chatter about the establishment in Nashville and especially bluegrass fans despising the fact that there was a young teenager who was making a hit record out of this Bill Monroe song, Blue Moon of Kentucky. Charlie Daniels said as much in the Ken Burns country music documentary. Marty Robbins in that documentary says that, Bill Monroe didn't like it at first, but, then he got his first royalty check and started telling people, I told those boys if there's anything they need, I'd be here to help them. According to the documentation I can find via Mr. Peter Guralnick, there's a totally different story there, but it did rub people in that establishment, bluegrass and Nashville audience the wrong way for sure, that they recorded it, that Sun Records put it out. They were, more traditionalists and in a world that was changing fast with all the electricity and the boogie woogie and the upbeat tempos and the young people doing some stuff. I mean, to some of them, that were more used to Appalachian tradition and bluegrass tradition and down homey kind of bluegrass country sound. I mean, bluegrass is not country. It's got its own thing entirely. It's its own galaxy of music entirely, and it doesn't swing like country swings. It doesn't yodel. I mean, I misspeak. It yodels and country music yodels, but I don't think they yodel quite the same. They kind of bleed into each other. I mean, but if there's anything that we know about rock and roll, it's the blues and hillbilly music coming together to make something amazing and volatile. And to the people that were steeped in bluegrass and hillbilly music, and maybe in their 40s and 50s and on, you're talking about a generation that's on death's door. It's not like today where the life expectancy could be like 75 to 95 years old. Set in their ways is, an understatement, I'm sure. To them, hearing Elvis Presley doing Blue Moon of Kentucky in the way that he and his band did it at Sun Records, I mean, that would be, for some of them, it had to be akin to like, if Marilyn Manson, and I know this is an outdated reference, but bear with me. Let's say Marilyn Manson, when he still had the band, or like he still had the Antichrist Superstar / Smells Like Children / Portrait of American Family era sort of band. Like they were still a going concern. He wasn't just like a solo artist with various players. What if at the height of his and their ascendancy, they covered Whitney Houston's The Greatest Love of All? And this is not an apples to apples comparison, mind you, but this is the best I've got right now. It's after midnight on a on a Saturday night and I'm just getting over a cold and I've slept in late, so now I'm staying up late. And I've been reading books all day and watching documentary footage all day and listening to podcasts about all this stuff. It's been an Elvis and Little Richard kind of day, and I'm brimming over with thoughts and comparisons. Let's say Marilyn Manson, Sweet Dreams era, through Antichrist Superstar era, maybe, comes out with a cover of Whitney Houston's Greatest Love of All. It's easy to, I believe the children are our future, all that stuff. All that schmaltz, all that heart, all that late 80s production, right? Thrown in the garbage. And he does it, or they do it, with just like horror noises and squidgy sounds and an industrial, like totally ripped off from like the Revolting Cocks drum samples and lots of screaming and howling and pigs having orgasm noises fed into a sampler and then used to sing the backup vocals with those pigs having orgasm noises. That's probably what these bluegrass traditionalists, and traditionalist being a relative term because we're talking about like 2 generations of Americans maybe at this point, 3 generations. I don't know. Don't take me to court over it. But, when it comes to the radio and recorded music, there's not a lot of history really. But they held on to what history they had. But it wasn't we're talking about a timeline from getting off of a boat on the east coast of America to moving into the mountains to coming down towards the cities so you can, get to the Grand Ole Opry within 2 generations of people probably. In 3 in some cases, but 1 in a lot of cases, for heaven's sake. What was my point? Oh, yes. What actually happened. So, Sam, good old Sam Phillips, the mastermind, the genius, the man who I just found out after all the research I've done for the last couple of years, only just now found out that he unfortunately had to undergo some shock treatment multiple times. Sam knows Blue Moon of Kentucky, was killing it on Billboard's territorial country and western chart for Memphis at number 3. That's All Right was right below it at number 4. And that's currency he can use. He's not just going to sit around and wait for an invitation to the goddamn Grand Ole Opry, right? And he knows it's making a stir because, there's backlash. He gets a letter from a Miami distributor that tells him a month after these chart positions, happen, that there are certain jukebox not even radio DJs, jukebox operators in the northern part of Florida, I guess, because it's from a Miami distributor, that will not play the record or touch the record or put it in their jukeboxes, rather, because it was too racy. Sam responds with a very, very diplomatic letter that reads, "We can understand that it might pose a problem for you by being so different and hard to catalog." That's a nice intro. That's a very, very understanding intro. That's a hey, I brought this on you. We did this crazy thing, and you're trying to figure out how to deal with it. Goes on to say, there is quite a big movement going on, which has come to our attention to keep country music country, whatever that is. And some DJs, like the operators you mentioned, are reluctant to play the sides because they don't want to set a precedent. This we know, however, when they do play the record and let the public decide, it takes off. He also says to them that, I've just arranged for Elvis to appear on the Grand Ole Opry, which should do a lot to boost his popularity. And there's also a Louisiana Hayride appearance coming up soon after. And that just reads like not even a threat, right? It's just what I've seen, knowing what I know, being the person that sends out these records and sells them when those stuffed shirts get out of the way and let the people have what they want, it tends to be popular, which means money in your goddamn pocket, you idiot. Oh, and also, we're going to blow it up on the Opry, and we're going to blow it up in the Hayride. So, yeah. To use another outdated reference, it could be an American Bandstand or a Total Request Live situation. Those were the things that we had before, all those American Idol shows and Eurovision shows and whatever other musical contests that probably keep, 99% of the rights to your music when they make you famous. Don't come after me with the fine print about the Univision contest and how they give all the money to sick puppies that have cancer or whatever. Whatever. I'm just making a reference. Fun note for me about the shitty attitude that Mr. Denny from the Grand Ole Opry had about the Louisiana Hayride. He referred to it derisively as the Grand Ole Opry's farm club because so many of its big acts eventually defected to Nashville. But we're talking about, I mean, it is kind of like a feeder system, right? To use a very rough sports analogy that I'm not at all qualified to use, like a AAA baseball kind of to the major leagues, or, if you're more of a scumbag, ECW, if you're the Paul Heyman, like the Louisiana Hayride is the Philadelphia Bingo Hall equivalent to Eric Bischoff and Vincent Kennedy McMahon. It was for three of you. Because the Hayride would actually break artists that the Nashville scene wasn't going to touch. Slim Whitman, Webb Pierce, Kitty Wells, Hank Williams, and Jim Reeves. Now, in general, the appearance on the Opry that night was short. They got to play one song. Sam Phillips would say to Bill Sachs in a letter he wrote. Bill Sachs wrote the folk talent and tunes column for Billboard magazine. He made a tremendous showing, and the crowd really warmed to him. You never would have dreamed that here was a lad who less than 2 months ago had never made any professional appearances of any kind. But what really overwhelmed Elvis was the wonderful treatment given him by all the Opry stars. Went out of their way to meet him and shake his hand, congratulate him on his record. Now, that generally could be corroborated, it turns out, but it does downplay the fact that Elvis was pretty disappointed that they tried really hard and against all the odds that Sam prepared them for. Jim Denny was really not blown away or impressed, and he didn't congratulate them. He didn't say, "Great job, boys." He didn't offer them any kind of a contract. He just said to Sam Phillips, "This boy is not bad." And I guess Sam said, "He didn't give me any great accolades. He just grabbed me by my skinny arm and said, 'This boy is not bad.' Well, people put down Jim Denny. Nobody much liked Jim. He was a damn tough man, but he did me a favor." Now, before I back up and expand on this whole story of the trip to the Grand Ole Opry a little bit more, anyone notice, if you watch the film, if you watch the scene that Elvis goes into the bathroom afterwards and smashes his guitar? Was it a little weird for you to watch him do that after having seen The Hateful Eight? If you've seen The Hateful Eight, especially if you're a guitar player, oof. And I'm a guitar fixer. Oh, it's even worse. If you don't know what I'm talking about, don't you worry your pretty little head about it. But it's a real thing. Seeing the young Kurt Russell smash a guitar like that, it's like an eerie trumpet call over a lost battlefield. Into the future, but in reverse. Let me read the words straight from Peter Guralnick about the experience the band had backstage at the Opry after getting there and being a little bit underwhelmed by how run down the Ryman Auditorium was at that point. The story of the Grand Ole Opry, very well told, I think, not that I'm an expert, but by Ken Burns in the country music documentaries. You can check those out. It's basically the story of three things all together: the Grand Ole Opry, the Carter family, and America, if nothing else. It's the story of a lot more than that, but I'll never stop recommending it for wanting to know about those three things. Backstage, the other musicians mingled freely, exchanging small talk and greetings, tuning up, donning makeup and costumes, without any of the formality or protocol that you might have expected from stars, but with all the remoteness, whether real or perceived, of big leaguers sniffing at bushers just up from the minors. 21-year-old bass player Buddy Killen, who just started as a chief and only song plugger for Tree Music, the publishing house at WSM program director Jack Stapp had set up in 1951, came up to the obviously out-of-place young singer and introduced himself. Elvis said, "They're going to hate me." I said, "They're not going to hate you. You're going to do fine." He said, "If they just let me leave, I'd go right now." Now, Song Plugger is a sort of short-lived, in its original form, music industry position where a publishing company that sells sheet music and records as well pays you to go to establishments that have either jukeboxes or live musicians and request the songs that the publishing company or whoever is paying you wants more play for. So, you go up, maybe tip a musician and say, "Hey, play Blue Moon of Kentucky," for lack of a better example. And they play it and they clap and they cheer and they like, "Play it again." They're super obnoxious and, they're probably like carousing with people and saying, "Oh, wasn't that a great song?" That was a job. That was a real job you had in this era. From the beginning of like recorded music in public in America, through well up to this time. And of course that would sort of mogrify into the kind of people at record companies that would make sure that certain songs got played on the radio and still do today. But their job was to get people to hear these new songs, in sort of a guerrilla sort of tactical way, because it would encourage folks to buy the piano sheet music to play the songs at home with their friends or buy a 45 RPM, record to play, or keep putting money in jukeboxes so that the owner of the jukebox and the venue has to buy that 45 again and again and again because it will wear out. As noted on other episodes, those things wore out pretty fast because industrial strength jukeboxes, unlike normal record players, had very heavy sort of machinery in them. And the tone arm that comes down with the needle on it is built of stiffer, sterner stock than the home model. And those needles had to last a long time and not need to be replaced. So they would kind of tear through the soft lacquer or wax or, acrylic at certain times, depending on what era we're talking about in recorded music history. They would, burn through those things if the song was popular enough. And if it makes people dance, it makes people drink. And if it makes people drink, it makes people spend more money. So you want to keep replacing that record. Back to the Opry. Smarty Robbins saw evidence of the same insecurity, says Peter Gorelnik. But when Elvis spotted Chet Atkins backstage, this is an important point for the guitar players out there. He introduced himself because he wasn't intimidated, like presumably by Chet Atkins, because he knows he's going to pull a move here. He introduced himself, and then, knowing Scotty Moore's admiration, his guitar player, for Atkins' playing, pulled Scotty over too, saying, "My guitar player wants to meet you." Chet Atkins apparently noted that the young man appeared to be wearing eye makeup. Of everyone that was there at the Opry, all the legends, the one that the band was the most sort of leery of at the time, the one they were not looking forward to running into, was Bill Monroe. The Peter Gorelnik book, Last Train to Memphis, says that, many in the country field continued to view the Sun Records version of Blue Moon of Kentucky as a desecration. And even Sam had heard that Monroe was going to take their head off for their untrammeled, I don't know what that word means, interpretation of his stately lament. "I heard he was going to break my jaw." But when they met Monroe, conservatively dressed in his dark suit and tie and trademark white hat, and at the age of 43, already an elder statesman, possessed of a dignity that permitted neither bullshit nor informality, he came right out and complimented them. As a matter of fact, he told them he had cut a new version of the song for Decca, due out next week, that followed their pattern. Other shenanigans that took place that night, Bill and Scotty's wives snuck out to the show. They live in Memphis and the show's in Nashville. And let's see. Bill peeked out at the audience, much to his surprise, discovered his wife, Evelyn, and Scotty's wife, Bobby, in the front row. I think he was kind of glad to see us, said Bobby, because they were wanting to come back to Memphis that night, and Sam was going to stay over in Nashville. You see, they had told Evelyn and me, y'all can't go. We're going in one car, and there's no room for you. Well, I accepted that. But then around noon, a couple of hours after they left, Evelyn came over to the house and said, let's go to Nashville. I said, oh, I don't know about that. We might get in trouble. But you know, we're really like Lucy and Ethel. That's a I Love Lucy reference. Can't help you if you don't know it, but it's a good one. They're in cahoots. They're plotting behind their husbands' backs to some end that's probably going to be a disaster or a really good time, is what she's saying. So then I said, what the heck? And we drove over. Bill stuck his head out the stage door and saw us, but when Scotty saw me backstage, it was like he'd seen a ghost. So the segment they've been given, the band, Elvis and the boys, is the Hank Snow segment, sponsored by Royal Crown Cola. And it takes place at 10:15. Hank Snow's son, Jimmy Rogers Snow, had just approached Elvis, got lost in his introduction of a young man from Memphis who's just made a hit record. Let's give him a nice round of applause. To the point that he totally forgot the name of the singer he was introducing. And Elvis comes bounding out from the side of the stage, and like he's just been thrown from a train car or something, which did not, I'm sure, endear him to the elder, stately audience of the Grand Ole Opry. They were super intense. They were super, physical and energetic and young compared to what they were used to. I think a lot of acts, if they were of his age, would probably come into the Opry very demure, very soft-spoken and thankful and just sort of polite, and probably sing a low-key song. Like, you know how like the Beatles got to play for the Queen, and they definitely weren't doing their rock and roll material for the most part. If you ever saw that footage, if you ever saw the Beatles anthology at any point, like they all got stoned, somewhere in the castle. Was it Castle Donington where the Queen lives? I think that's where the Queen lives. Or that's where Queen played. No, that's Wembley. Shit. Anyway, they went out there and did standards, for the royal family and the royal audience. They didn't come out with like Twist and Shout and Long Tall Sally, because they knew that would not go over well. I assume that's what young artists would do at the Grand Ole Opry. Not so Elvis. They got a very tepid, polite, sort of, lukewarm reaction from the crowd, as if to say, okay, what's the next thing? Like, it's not going to be more of this, is it? And then backstage, everyone was really nice to them. A lot of folks were kind of huddled around them, talking about the reception. Bobby and Evelyn insisted it was a good reception. Like, hey, we were in the audience. We were in the front row. Nobody hates you. So the Opry was an evening show. And while they were in town, they went down to the Ernest Tubb record shop where they were going to play the Midnight Jamboree, which just went on the air live from Ernest Tubb's record store as soon as the Opry broadcast was over. If you don't know much about Ernest Tubb and you're curious about some serious hardcore country music legend and his history, may I recommend the first couple of episodes of the podcast, Cocaine and Rhinestones, History of Country Music podcast. Now, while they were there, somebody introduces young Elvis Presley to Mr. Ernest Tubb himself, who turns out was very gracious and was evidently very patient with Elvis, as the 19-year-old just like gushed out all his love for Ernest Tubb's music and told him that, it was his real ambition to sing country music. And he said, they tell me if I'm going to make any money, though, I've got to sing this other kind of music. What should I do? I said, Elvis, have you ever made any money? He said, no, sir. I said, well, you just go ahead and do what they tell you to do. Make your money. Then you can do what you want to do. which is kind of disheartening to read, because I think one of the things that the John Carpenter film does well is show us how trapped he felt later when he wanted to be in command of his own music career, when he really, really, really wanted to hear his records sound the way he heard them in his head. And when he's complaining in the film about how the Jordanaires' voices are too low and his lead vocal is too loud, and he doesn't want to do another, he's got to go do another damn like movie soundtrack thing. These songs he doesn't believe in, the songs he doesn't care about. I think a lot about how much recording Johnny Cash did at the end of his life to fill up, his discography with gospel songs and songs from his mother's, My Mother's Songbook, I think was one of his albums towards the end, kind of make good on that promise to sort of get down all that stuff that made you who you were. And I'm pretty sure Elvis would have done that if he'd had the power. But yeah, reading that quote from Ernest Tubb just breaks my heart. Like, instead of doing what he wanted to do on records, he was doing karate and giving monologues in Vegas and just, singing about clam bakes. Now, let's talk about the fellas going to play the Louisiana Hayride. And it's obviously after the Grand Ole Opry appearance, and was advertised as such, as being hey, this kid played the Opry with the strength of only one song, so you should probably pay attention to this show when he comes down here to Shreveport. And the quotes I'm reading from the story featured in Peter Guralnick's Last Train to Memphis, I think do a great job of setting up the scene for that, camaraderie backstage that the guys encountered when they were there, their first trip to play Louisiana with good old Sam. They were in quite a rush to get there because it was a long drive from Memphis. They had just finished up playing their regular Friday night engagement at a place called the Eagle's Nest, and then hopped in the car, Sam, Elvis, Scotty, and Bill, for a 7 to 8 hour drive, turns out. They missed a turnoff at Greensville, Mississippi, because Bill had everybody laughing too much at the jokes he was cracking. And then Scotty almost ran into a team of mules that were crossing the road because he was driving so fast and not, paying attention to the possibility of mules. After they arrived in town, checked into their hotel, spent a day getting ready while Sam went and made some rounds in Shreveport to see some people he knew in the business that hadn't seen in a while. The guys show up wearing their on-stage regalia, which consists of Elvis in a pink jacket, white pants, black shirt, and a bright-colored clip-on bow tie. Two-tone shoes that were known as correspondent shoes because they were the kind that a salesman or correspondent in a divorce case might be expected to wear. Scotty and Bill wore matching Western shirts with decorative bibs and dark ties. Bill played his stand-up bass. It looks very, very battered and worn out and beat to shit. Elvis's guitar, pretty small looking and unprofessional, looked childlike almost. Compared to, what the pros were using. Like Scotty, who had a Gibson ES 295, not the most expensive guitar in the universe, but it had a little more class to it compared to what he was standing next to. But I think a small body size acoustic guitar worked in Elvis's favor because it's easy to swing and move back and forth across your body while your hips are gyrating and twisting and stuff. You don't want a big jumbo size Gibson acoustic blocking the goods, right? Or that you have to pull out of the way to show off the goods. Now, while the MC or the host is warming up the crowd and getting them all to sing along with their traditional sort of invocation, which is the Hayride tradition, singing an old minstrel type song called Raise a Ruckus Tonight. The there's a tall, skinny singer from Shreveport with a television show in Monroe, sidling up to the boys backstage, about 20 years old, already knocked out by the Elvis Presley singing he's heard on a jukebox in West Monroe. Man said, "Hello, Elvis. My name is Merle Kilgore." Elvis turns around and says, "Oh, you work with Hank Williams." I said, "Yeah." He said, "You wrote More and More," which was a number one hit for an artist named Webb Pierce in the fall of 1954. And Merle said, "Yeah." And Elvis says, "I want to meet Tibby Edwards." He said it was the first thing he said to me. Tibby recorded for Mercury, and he was a star. I said, "He's my buddy. We roomed together here in Shreveport." And I went and got Tibby and introduced him to Elvis. That's how we got to be friends. Now, Merle Kilgore, I looked into because it's not a name that I know. So like a fool, the first thing I did was hit a button on my smart cellular phone device, handheld equipment with the speaker and the microphone on it with all the apps, and said, "Merle Kilgore, country songwriter," to see what would come up. Well, it just started playing "I Ain't That Lonely Yet" by Dwight Yoakam. My first thought was, wow, did he write something this modern, or did Dwight cover something that old? And my second thought was, I better go to Wikipedia. And then my third thought was, oh, I'm going to be sitting here listening to like at least 5 Dwight Yoakam songs now because I'm not turning this off. And then I got emotional because Dwight Yoakam always does that to me. I'm not made of stone, people. Now, Merle did not write any of Dwight Yoakam's hits. He did write or co-wrote Ring of Fire with June Carter. He was actually sort of a distant cousin of the Carter family and had written with and worked with many of the female members of the Carter family. He also went on to write Wolverton Mountain, which is a song that I didn't know until I heard the record Countrypolitan Favorites by Southern Culture on the Skids. Highly recommend it. It's kind of like a fun, jovial, old-timey storytelling, bouncy country music stuff. Got some light female harmonized yodeling in it, and who doesn't like that from time to time? And if you're a casual country fan, you probably don't know a lot of stuff he did. I am more than a casual country fan, and I certainly didn't know most of what I was reading when I read the list, but he's been a part of a lot of great work, a lot of great duets, and a lot of great projects. Eventually, he became Hank Williams Jr.'s manager. Got him all set up with a Monday Night Football gig, it turns out. So for everyone that was insecure about whether or not enough people cared, whether you personally were ready for some football, and then achieved a certain level of, let's say, serenity after finding out that indeed it was on Hank Williams Jr.'s mind enough to record it and broadcast it across the airwaves every week for you to be asked if you are ready for some football, and if that made you feel better about life, then you can thank Merle Kilgore for that. So now the time comes for the boys to take the stage, and the announcer, Frank Page, says, "Just a few weeks ago," I'm not doing an impression here, I don't know what his voice sounds like, "a young man from Memphis, Tennessee recorded a song on the Sun label. And in just a matter of a few weeks, that record has skyrocketed right up the charts. It's doing really good all over the country. He is only 19 years old. He has a new, distinctive style. Elvis Presley. Let's give him a nice hand. Elvis, how are you this evening?" "Just fine. How are you, sir? You all geared up with your band?" "I'm all geared up. To let us hear your songs? Well, I'd like to say how happy we are to be out here. It's a real honor for us to get a chance to appear on the Louisiana Hayride. And we're going to do a song for you. You got anything else to say, sir?" "No, I'm ready. We're going to do a song for you, and we got it on the Sun record. It goes something like this." And then they launch into That's All Right, Mama. The fellas were not confident that night. Even Scotty was a little hesitant and uncertain and taking his guitar solo. They had to turn up like the microphones near him on stage. So that was like their way of giving you a little volume boost when it was time for you to throw out a lead. It still didn't help come across any conviction, but Sam Phillips noticed the crowd wanted to like the guys, but the guys weren't relaxed. They weren't confident yet. but he knew they would respond to Elvis's charm if they got the chance. And they're backstage a little bit later before they were set to go on for another crowd that comes in or just a second performance that night. Merle Kilgore watched them all in a little huddle off in the corner with Sam kind of giving them a pep talk and telling Elvis to just relax. The people were there to see him. Just let them see what you got. Put on your kind of a show. If it didn't work, well, the hell with it. At least we can say we tried. Now, when the second show started, Sam's out there in the audience again, and he noted a lot of the young people from a nearby college that were there for the first performance stayed for the second performance as well. Sam says, there was a college up in Texarkana where Elvis records had gotten hot. And some of the young people from that college had turned up. Well, when he got through that first number, they were on their feet. And not just them either. Some big fat lady. I mean, it took an effort for her to get up. She got up and didn't stop talking right in the middle of the next number. She didn't know who I was, and she just said, man, have you ever heard anything that good? And honestly, the tonal impact couldn't have competed with the Maddox brothers and Rose or the Carlyles who had been there the week before. I mean, they were pros. But Elvis had this factor of communication. I think the audience saw in him the desire to please. He had that little innocence about him, and yet he had something about him that was almost impudent in a way. That was his crutch. He certainly didn't mean to be impudent, but he had had enough of that, along with what he could convey, that was just beautiful, lovely. And I'm not talking about his physical beauty, because he didn't look that pretty then, or that good looking. By conventional standards, he could have been thrown off that stage. But I calculated that stuff in my mind. Are they going to resent him with his long sideburns? That could be a plus or a minus. But when he came through like he did, it was neither. He stood on his own. Now, they did 2 songs, left the stage, even though the crowd was really liking them. No encores, not allowed. They're not the only ones there doing stuff on stage. There's got to be time for other people. Evidently, the only person that got away with doing encores at Louisiana Hayride up to that point had been Hank Williams when he sang Lovesick Blues 7 times in a row. And the crowd would have stayed to hear him do it even more if he hadn't left. Merle Kilgore said, I think he scared them a little in the first show. He was really on the toes of his feet singing. I think they thought he was going to jump off the stage. And that's an implied physical threat for these audiences. This is not like jumping off the stage in like the 80s or the 90s or even the 70s. This is like very prim and proper. There's a division between the audience and the performers up there. It's more theatrical. It's more removed. This is it's not a free for all. Like, not cool necessarily to just like physically, I don't know, be so outwardly projective with your energy, with your with your body language. Like, you're going to just, like somebody gets twitchy around you at a bar, someone you don't know. Like, are they going to throw a punch my way, or are they just talking with their hands too much, kind of a thing? So, Merle says when he came back out, he destroyed them because by now they knew he wasn't going to jump off the stage and beat them, and they absolutely exploded. Also, with some notes on this viewing experience, was 27-year-old Jimmy C. Newman, who had a big hit on the Dot label with Cry Cry Darling. He said, I'd never seen anything like it before. Here comes this guy. And I don't know his voices. I'm just doing stuff. I'm just doing stuff here, all right? By God, if you heard what I did with Steve Vai's voice, you'd be prepared for this. He says, I'd never seen anything like it before. Here comes this guy. I guess you could almost call him an amateur. Rings of dirt on his neck. But he had it all right from the start. He didn't work into it. He just knew what he was going to do. We just stand in the wings and shake our heads. It can't be. It can't last. It's got to be a fad. What he did was he changed it all around. After that, we had to go to Texas to work. there wasn't any work anywhere else because they all wanted someone to imitate Elvis, to jump up and down on stage and make a fool of themselves. It was embarrassing to me to see it. Elvis could do it, but few others could. Now, let me wrap this section up with a little note. I paused after I was done and went and found the recorded track of the Louisiana Hayride performance from October 1954. And I didn't capture the delivery of the host or his conversation with Elvis anywhere near what it sounds like. I'm not going to redo it because I'm not doing impressions of them. I've grown up with bad impressions of Elvis my whole life in popular culture, which is why I didn't even bother doing an accent. I don't want to. That's weird and gross. But Scotty Moore was kicking some ass on that guitar until his solo came up, and he has a brain fart or a hand stumbulation in one little spot. One little. Oh man. I'm not criticizing. I'm just going, damn, that must have pissed him off. Like, that must have made him so frustrated because he just drops it out. Like, the note just goes, like, he just drops a note. There's like a thump, and it's like a beat and a half before he recovers and he gets back into the solo as you would normally hear. Like, he probably went to improvise something and then just his mind went blank for a second, or who knows. There's got to be an interview about that somewhere with Scotty. He lived a pretty good long life, so hopefully the story's out there. Let's move on to some other stuff. Now, I don't want to give the impression that I'm going to just take you through a chronological history of Elvis and everything he did in his career. Obviously, I've leapt over his upbringing and his early days as a child and all of his first, sort of musical test in the waters kind of things. We'll get into his sort of meeting with Sun Records and Sam Phillips, I think, in the next episode. I'm not going to go chronologically. I'm just going in the order of various sources of material that I find interesting and mixed up with thoughts about the movie. And I say all this to set up the next piece of material I'm going to draw a reference from, which is a couple years in the future and nowhere near Mississippi or Louisiana or Tennessee. We are going to head all the way up to the Great White North, albeit the western side of the Great White North, up near where yours truly resides, sort of the southwest of the Great White North. Let's throw to me from a couple days in the past. Okay, now, let's look into an October 1957 issue of Music World. This is published up in Canada. It's referred to on the front as Canada's only popular music publication. There is a solemn-looking picture of Elvis, sort of sitting down and looking to his left, quizzically, or maybe poutingly. And then there's a black and white photo. I mean, the whole thing's black and white. There's another photo below that of him in a press conference where he looks a little dazed or in between facial expressions. And everyone around him, like, no one looks happy at all. Everyone seems to be pressing him or disapproving. It looks fairly staged for the shot, but clearly there was a press conference. There's people there with like 4 different microphones. Some of them have call letters on them from the radio station that they're from. This is the kind of newspaper that how there'll be short, like really short stories in the first couple of pages. They say things like, there's a couple paragraphs each. Southern music chief here. Country stars skidded to head Casino Week. When they talk about Smoky Mountain Boys with Pap and his jug band and Bashful Brother Oswald, Howdy Forrester, and others who have recorded for Decca Records are apparently coming to Casino Week, as well as Roy Acuff. So that's kind of a big deal. Hi-Fi Exposition in Toronto. And then there's Helen Breaks Thumb. The many friends of jazz critic Helen McNamara would be sorry to learn that she has been the victim of a painful accident. A car door was slammed on her left hand, and her thumb was broken. She is now resting in her Toronto home, but hopes to be back at work shortly. So that's with that as preparation. Let's get to page 5 of the October 15th issue. Elvis in Vancouver. Screaming fans stop the Presley show. Music World special by Bob Turner. Take a carnival. Add a little bit of cheating. Throw in some gang warfare and a little riot with just a pinch of music. Then stir it liberally with a heavy beat and a pair of gyrating hips. So obviously this is going to be a hit piece. Notice how pointedly they wrote just a pinch of music. We'll get to that in a second. Pour it all into Canada's biggest stadium, garnish with a crowd of nearly 20,000 screaming teenagers, and you have a dish that gave Vancouver incurable indigestion. Vancouver's Empire Stadium has had some big moments in its few years of life, like the Miracle Mile, Dr. Roger Bannister and John Landy at the British Empire Games in 1954, and the Grey Cup in 1955. But absolutely nothing could match the rock-rolling riotousness of the visit of the King, Elvis Presley, on August 31st. 100 of the city's finest strove mightily to keep things on an even keel, but the pelvis was hardly through his first number, Heartbreak Hotel, when the dam broke. The pint-sized shock troops of the rock and roll movement hurled themselves across the space between the stands and the stage with such enthusiasm, or dementia, that city policemen, air cadets, and stadium police gave way. Hoodlums fought with police, pushed, screamed, and kicked, just like the spoiled children they are. Finally, order was restored when stadium officials threatened to stop the show unless the mob returned to their seats. The show went on. But soon, they were all back down around the stage again, so the former Tennessee truck driver cut his performance short after 5 songs, and mid the dying notes of "You Ain't Nothing But a Hound Dog," scurried out the back entrance with his tail between his legs to a waiting Cadillac that whisked him away before his enraged fans knew what happened. A public address announcement that their idol was not in the stadium and suggesting that they might as well go home didn't help a bit. For a full 15 minutes, the hoodlum element staged open warfare with the police on and around the stage. The crowd, claimed by promoters to be in the neighborhood of 22,000, was reliably estimated at around 16,000 by Pacific National Exhibition and Stadium officials. At the time, to take for what promoters have called Canada's biggest theatrical presentation was in the neighborhood of $45,000, of which Elvis would pocket about $28,000. Not bad for a half hour's work. I apologize, that accent is probably not representative of the West Coast region of Canada. Probably, what is that? Is that more middle? Is that more east? Becoming increasingly impatient as an hour and a half of all-star entertainment dragged on with no sign of Elvis. They don't say what the all-star entertainment was? Okay. The audience was ready for the kill when he finally did arrive. Then by cutting his appearance to about half an hour of his more famous songs, he left most of the audience feeling cheated, especially when nearly all teenagers had paid as much as $3 a seat. Incidentally, the so-called star entertainment was picked up mainly in Seattle on the way through. What? What does that mean? The so-called all-star entertainment, meaning the opening acts, I guess, was picked up mainly in Seattle on the way through. Well, la-di-da. Just a bunch of Seattleites, not all-stars. Okay, I resent that, considering where I live and where I'm from. Presley's scheduled entrance aboard a rented Cadillac from a large Vancouver car dealer was held up while the dealer was assured that the singer had insurance against mob violence. They don't specify whether he means, mob as in a large crowd of people. I assume that's what it is, not organized crime violence. Around the perimeter of the stadium, he rode, and it was the closest look anyone got. Even the most expensive seats were over 200 feet away. With all the bedlam, fans were unable to hear what songs he did sing. Police and officials feel that this was largely what set off the first wave of rioting. The second was apparently caused by the shortness of the program. One thing should be established. Only about 2,000 of the crowd caused all the trouble. The rest stayed in their seats. Asked if the problem had ever occurred before, Presley's keeper, Colonel Tom Parker, said, "Yeah, it happens all the time." Spelled Y-E-H and A-L-L-A. Musically, this writer cannot and will not attempt any improvement on the review by John Kirkwood in the Vancouver Sun. Quote, "For 35 minutes, Elvis, wearing a shimmering gold jacket and black pants, staggered across the stage at the Bowl's north end like a drunk picking his way home on New Year's morning. He glazed his eyes, twisted his youthful face in a sullen sneer, swiveled his hips, dropped drunkenly to his knees, and threw himself into more bumps and grinds than the PNE girly shows have seen for years," unquote. Vancouver's press was not kind to Elvis. He didn't deserve kindness. He brought to Vancouver a poor show of mediocre entertainers, timed everything to cause the most possible trouble, and then left, leaving his adoring public holding ticket stubs. The Vancouver Police Department a riot, and with $45,000 of BC's money. Didn't they earlier say it was $28,000? Elvis would pocket about $28,000. Yeah. All right. But let's see. The take was $45,000. Elvis gets $28,000. They don't say where. I guess they don't say where the rest of it goes. Is that? That's whatever. Now we skip ahead to the end of it on page 34 after features like, Andy Williams, or introducing Andy Williams or whatever, and then there's a somewhat positive coverage of a rock and roll show that features Buddy Holly and the Crickets and Paul Anka and about 4 or 5 other artists. So they're not it's explicitly anti-rock music necessarily. They really hate Elvis. It says Seattle's Solly Volchuk, promoter of the show, was a happy man, musically impartial. He was seen at an after-the-show party at the Penthouse wearing 2 badges on his lapel. One read, "I hate Elvis." The other, "I love Elvis." He could afford to be amusing. Musically, the less said, the better. Elvis was backed by guitars, piano, drums. The pre-show was backed by 13 Vancouver musicians who turned in a fine job, sight-reading their way through a tumbling act, a tenor, a female marimbaphonist, a vocal group, and a tap dancer, and others. The lineup included some of Vancouver's finest musicians under the leadership of pianist Chris Gage. Yeah, then they list out who played what horns. In terms of dollars and cents, it wasn't successful, but it won't happen again. If Elvis comes back, he'll have to do his gyrating on a downtown street corner. Sure he will. As far as the Pacific National Exhibition officials are concerned, he can't come back to any part of the Empire Stadium or PNE. And they have extended this rule to cover any similar type of entertainer. Now, I want to, move towards the end of this episode with a nice, big, huge, ground-up stump of a piece of writing from a fellow that I admire greatly. If you've heard me yammer about the rock writers I really, really love, there's basically 2. I'll be featuring one of them on this episode and the other likely on the next episode, unless I break this up into 3. I don't know. What I'm saying is Nick Toshi's writing will be showing up not today. Nope. Today is going to be a little bit of reading from the pages of a book called Psychotic Reactions and Carburetor Dung. Because I want to be real about this stuff. I want to be real about this legacy, and I want the viewpoint of a person who had something to say about Elvis when he died that wasn't what everybody else was saying in the papers when Elvis died. And as with Lester Bangs' writing, sometimes you won't be able to tell if he's being nice or if he's being mean. He's probably being neither. Probably he's just being himself. And I was still sick when I recorded this bit, and I don't feel like redoing it. Because I'm brave, sensitive, and vulnerable. I want you to know it. Where were you when Elvis died? What were you doing? And what did it give you an excuse to do with the rest of your day? That's what we'll be talking about in the future when we remember this grand occasion. Like Pearl Harbor or JFK's assassination, it boiled down to individual reminiscences, which is perhaps as it should be, because in spite of his greatness, etc., etc., Elvis had left us each as alone as he was. I mean, he wasn't exactly a man of the people anymore, if you get my drift. If you don't, I will drift even further away from Elvis into the contemplation of why all our public heroes seem to reinforce our own solitude. The ultimate sin of any performer is contempt for the audience. Those who indulge in it will ultimately reap the scorn of those they've dumped on, whether they live forever, like Andy Paleface Warhol, or die fashionably early, like Lenny Bruce, Jimi Hendrix, Janis Joplin, Jim Morrison, Charlie Parker, Billie Holiday. The two things that distinguish those deaths from Elvis's, he and they having drug habits vaguely in common, were that all of them died on the outside, looking in, and none of them took their audience for granted, which is why it's just a little bit harder for me to see Elvis as a tragic figure. I see him as being more like the Pentagon, a giant armored institution nobody knows anything about except that its power is legendary. Obviously, we all liked Elvis better than the Pentagon. But look at what a paltry statement that is. In the end, Elvis's scorn for his fans as manifested in new albums full of previously recorded material and one new song to make sure all us suckers would buy it, was mirrored in the scorn we all secretly, or not so secretly, felt for a man who came closer to godhood than Carlos Castaneda until military conscription tamed and revealed him for the dumb lackey he always was in the first place. And ever since, for almost 2 decades now, we've been waiting for him to get wild again. Fools that we are. And he probably knew better than any of us in his heart of hearts that it was never going to happen. His heart of hearts, so obviously not being our collective heart of hearts. He being so obviously just some poor, dumb Southern boy with a big daddy manager to screen the world for him and filter out anything which might erode his status as a big, strapping baby, bringing home the bucks, and finally being sort of perversely celebrated, at least by rock critics, for his utter contempt for whoever cared about him. And Elvis was perverse. Only a true pervert could put out something like Having Fun with Elvis on Stage, that album released 3 or so years back, which consisted entirely of between-song, on-stage patter. So redundant, it would make both Willie Burroughs and Gert Stein blush. Pause for your narrator to interject a little bit. Two things I want to mention. The notion of him selling something that was in between stage banner. I just watched a video explaining how popular Oasis used to be in the 90s, that someone put out a bootleg interview of the brothers in Oasis, the Gallagher brothers, just having a fight with each other, recorded by a journalist that was interviewing them. And it was like in the Billboard charts. Rock and roll, man. Rock and roll. And also the 1977 era, people saying, oh, there was this, this new compilation with only one new song for you suckers. In the early 2000s, Elvis had, I think, what I would assume is his last number one hit with Little Less Talk, A Lot More Action, Dance Remix on the Elvis number ones compact disc that was released at that time. Funny. Apologies for the state of my voice. Rock and roll never sleeps. And Memorial Day weekend colds must do what they do. I went to see Testament and Exodus and Death Angel 6 days ago. First time I've been out to a concert where I was down in the pit, as they say, in a couple of years. So very natural in the post-pandemic era that I got a cold from that. I hope no one's listening to this 10 years later saying, ho, 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 post-pandemic, you say, in May 2022? Ha, 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 ha. You didn't know what was coming after that. Anyways, back to Mr. Lester Bangs. Elvis was into marketing boredom when Andy Warhol was still doing shoe ads. But Elvis's sin was his failure to realize that his fans were not perverse. They loved him without qualification. No matter what he dumped on them, they loyally lapped it up. And that's why I feel a hell of a lot sorrier for all those poor jerks than for Elvis himself. I mean, who's left they can stand all night in the rain for? Nobody. And the true tragedy is the tragedy of an entire generation, which refuses to give up its adolescence even as it feels its menopausal paunch begin to blossom and its hair recede over the horizon, along with Elvis and everything else they once thought they believed in. Will they care in 5 years what he's been doing for the last 20? Sure, Elvis's death is a relatively minor ironic variant on the future shock mazurka. And perhaps the most significant thing about Elvis's exit is that the entire history of the 70s has been retreads and brutal demystification. 3 of Elvis's ex-bodyguards recently got together with this hacker from the New York Post and whipped up a book which dosed us with all the dirt we've been yearning for so long. Elvis was the last of our sacred cows to be publicly mutilated. Everybody knows Keith Richards likes his junk. But when Elvis went on stage in a stupor, nobody breathed a hint of Quaalude. In a way, this was both good and bad. Good because Elvis wasn't encouraging other people to think it was cool to be a walking physician's desk reference. Bad because Elvis stood for that Nixonian secrecy as virtue, which was passed off as the essence of Americanism for a few years there. In a sense, he could be seen not only as a phenomenon, that exploded in the 50s to help shape the psychic jailbreak of the 60s, but ultimately as a perfect cultural expression of what the Nixon years were all about. Not that he prospered more then, but that his passion for the privacy of potentates allowed him to get away with almost literal murder, certainly with the symbolic rape of his fans, meaning that we might all do better to think about waving goodbye with one upraised finger. I got the news of Elvis's death while drinking beer with a friend and fellow music journalist on his fire escape on 21st Street in Chelsea. Chelsea is a good neighborhood, in spite of the fact that the insane woman who lives upstairs keeps him awake all night, every night, with her rants at no one. My friend stays there because he likes the sense of community within diversity in that neighborhood. Old-time, card-carrying communists live in his building alongside people of every persuasion, popularly lumped as ethnic. When we hear about Elvis, we knew a wake was in order. So I went out to the deli for a case of beer. As I left the building, I passed some Latin guys hanging out by the front door. Heard the news? Elvis is dead, I told them. They looked at me with a contemptuous indifference. So what? Maybe if I had told them Donna Summer was dead, I might have gotten a reaction. I do recall walking in this neighborhood wearing a t-shirt that said, "Disco sucks," with a vast, unamused muttering in my wake, which only goes to show that not for everyone was Elvis the still reigning king of rock and roll. In fact, not for everyone is rock and roll the still reigning music. By now, each citizen has found his own little obsessive corner to blast his brains in, as the 60s were supremely narcissistic. Solipsism's what the 70s have been about, and nowhere is this better demonstrated than in the world of pop music. And Elvis may have been the greatest solipsist of all. I asked for 2 six-packs at the deli and told the guy behind the counter the news. He looked 50 years old, graying, big belly, life still in his eyes, and he said, "Shit, that's too bad. I guess our only hope now is if the Beatles get back together." 50 years old. I told him I thought that would be the biggest anticlimax in history, and that the best thing the Stones could do now would be to break up and spare us all further embarrassments. He laughed and gave me directions to a meat market down the street. There I asked the counterman the same question that I had been asking everyone. He was in his 50s too, and he said, "You know what? I don't care that bastard's dead. I took my wife to see him in Vegas in 73. We paid $14 a ticket, and he came out and sang for 20 minutes, then he fell down. Then he stood up and sang a couple more songs. Then he fell down again. Finally, he said, 'Well, shit, might as well sing sitting as standing.' So he squatted on the stage and asked the band what song they wanted to do next. But before they could answer, he was complaining about the lights. 'They're too bright,' he says. 'They hurt my eyes. Put them out or I don't sing a note.' So they do. So me and my wife are sitting in total blackness, listening to this guy sing songs we knew and loved. And I ain't just talking about his old goddamn songs, but he totally butchered all of them. Fuck him. I'm not saying I'm glad he's dead, but I know one thing. I got taken when I went to see Elvis Presley. I got taken too the one time I saw Elvis, but in a totally different way. It was the autumn of 1971, and 2 tickets to an Elvis show turned up at the offices of Cream magazine, where I was then employed. it was decided that those staff members who had never had the privilege of witnessing Elvis should get the tickets, which was how me and the art director, Charlie Oringer, ended up in nearly the front row of the biggest arena in Detroit. Earlier, Charlie had said, "Do you realize how much we could get if we sold these fucking things?" I didn't, but how precious they were became totally clear the instant Elvis sauntered onto the stage. He was the only male performer I have ever seen to whom I responded sexually. It wasn't real arousal, rather an erection of the heart when I looked at him, and I went mad with desire and envy and worship and self-projection. I mean, Mick Jagger, whom I saw as far back as 1964 and twice in 65, never even came close. There was Elvis, dressed up in this ridiculous white suit, which looked like some studded Arthurian castle, and he was too fat, and the buckle on his belt was as big as your head, except that your head is not made of solid gold, and any lesser man would have been the spitting image of Neil Diamond, damn fool, in such a getup. But on Elvis, it fit. What didn't? No matter how lousy his records ever got, no matter how intently he pursued mediocrity, there was still some hint, some flash left over from the days when, well, I wasn't there, so I won't presume to comment. But I will say this: Elvis Presley was the man who brought overt, blatant, vulgar, sexual frenzy to the popular arts in America, and thereby to the nation itself, since putting popular arts and America in the same sentence seems almost redundant. It has been said that he was the first white to sing like a black person, which is untrue in terms of hard facts, but totally true in terms of cultural impact. But what's more crucial is that when Elvis started wiggling his hips and Ed Sullivan refused to show it, the entire country went into a paroxysm of sexual frustration, leading to abiding discontent, which culminated in the explosion of psychedelic militant folklore, which was the 60s. I mean, don't tell me about Lenny Bruce, man. Lenny Bruce said dirty words in public and obtained a kind of consensual martyrdom. Plus which, Lenny Bruce was hip, too goddamn hip if you ask me, which was his undoing. Whereas Elvis was not hip at all. Elvis was a goddamn truck driver who worshipped his mother and would never say shit or fuck around her. And Elvis alerted America to the fact that it had a groin with imperatives that had been stifled. Lenny Bruce demonstrated how far you could push a society as repressed as ours and how much you could get away with. But Elvis kicked "How much is that doggy in the window?" out the window and replaced it with "Let's fuck." The rest of us are still reeling from the impact. Sexual chaos reigns currently, but out of chaos may flow true understanding and harmony. In either way, Elvis almost single-handedly opened the floodgates. That night in Detroit, a night I will never forget, he had but to ever so slightly move one shoulder muscle. Not even a shrug. And the girls in the gallery, hit by its ray, screamed, fainted, howled in heat. Literally every time this man moved any part of his body, the slightest centimeter, tens of thousands of people went berserk. Not Sinatra, not Jagger, not the Beatles. Nobody you can come up with ever elicited such hysteria among so many. And this, after a decade and a half of crappy records, of making a point of not trying. If love truly is going out of fashion forever, which I do not believe, then along with our nurtured indifference to each other will be an even more contemptuous indifference to each other's objects of reverence. I thought it was Iggy Stooge. You thought it was Joni Mitchell, or whoever else seemed to speak for your own private, entirely circumscribed situations, many pains and few ecstasies. We will continue to fragment in this manner because solipsism holds all the cards at present. It is a king whose domain engulfs even Elvis's. But I can guarantee you one thing. We will never again agree on anything as we agreed on Elvis. So I won't bother saying goodbye to his corpse. I will say goodbye to you. Village Voice, 29 August 1977. Lester Bangs. All right, I think that'll do us for now. Thanks for being here through this whole thing. Thanks for giving a damn about rock and roll. Thanks for giving a damn about how movies are made. I do not have patrons at this time. I do not have advertisers at this time. Who knows when that'll change. But if you would like to support, there's a link you can click in the description for this, and you can donate, or you can buy a shirt, or you could just give me a follow on a couple of social media outlets that are listed there with links. And you can please tell a friend about this show. I think that would be wonderful, and I would appreciate it almost as much as anything. Just to know that no matter what happens for the rest of my life, at least somebody heard this stuff, including the music that I record for all these episodes. It's very nice to know that somebody in the UK, Russia, New Zealand, Australia, Spain, and amazingly, lots of folks in India are downloading the episodes and hearing this stuff. According to the statistics I'm looking at, as I've said previously, perhaps I'm wrong. Perhaps it's just a bunch of American perverts with VPNs and no one outside the U.S. is actually hearing these. I don't know. Rock and roll is the best thing I've found in this whole life. I think it's just the best. So are you.